Okay, so let's talk about Charlemagne. So who the heck was Charlemagne? Well, he was a Frank, which is one of those sort of Germanic cultures and peoples that we were looking at. Basically, he established a new empire among the Franks in that sort of north of Italy, France and Germany type of area. And this was a family, his family was known as the Carolingians. And they had been doing some conquering, been pretty successful kings, more successful than the Romans were being at that point. And they were conquering in the 700s and 800s. And they took that their sort of Frankish kingdoms and they made them more of a Frankish empire, ruling over basically that territory of France and Germany that we were looking at. And then Charlemagne was the one who sort of presided over it at its furthest extent. And Charlemagne, his name can be translated a lot of different ways. Carol, you could call him Carolus. You could call him Carl, Charles, Carl with a K. All those are sort of different versions of the name and different names that actually derive from the Carolingians themselves. But we tend to call him Charles Magne. That's his French name, which would mean Karl the Great. So Karl the Great was a successful king, but he was successful not just in the fact that he was a good conqueror or a strong leader or anything like that. He was also very successful from a religious perspective. So, by this time period, by the 700s and 800s, religion was extremely important in Europe. Christianity was spreading further and further north. It hadn't gotten all the way to the Vikings yet, but it was going to get there. And this was primarily Christianity as taught by the church, which is eventually going to be known as the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And Charlemagne knew a good deal when he saw it, and what he basically did is he made an alliance with the Pope. Also known as the Bishop of Rome. So he made an alliance with the Bishop of Rome, Leo III. And Leo III was having to be a little bit of a warrior in addition to being a religious leader because people were constantly trying to take over Rome. And so he had his little tiny territory staked out and was defending it from other invaders. And Charlemagne comes in and says, okay, hey, buddy, let me help you. And they made a deal. And so on Christmas in the year 800, which is a great round year that's very easy to remember, so that's why I like it. On Christmas Day 800, Leo declared Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman. Well, it's a new name for his territory, which is now going to be called the Holy Roman Empire, which is sort of controls France and Germany up to Rome. A little bit of Italy up to Rome. And okay, the one problem with this is it's sort of he's claiming to be the Roman Empire, but a famous guy, Voltaire, quipped that the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. Which, fair enough. It wasn't as big as the Roman Empire. It wasn't as significant as the Roman Empire. And it was way more of a political unit than it was necessarily anything to do with religion. But you can see why Charlemagne might have wanted that. Like, think about this. Why would he want to be called the Roman Emperor? If you're called the Roman Emperor, that's going to give you a lot more status and cred, right? It's going to make you seem much more legitimate, much more powerful, much more significant. And so he is definitely propping himself up. And here's the thing, he's propping the Pope Leo, up as well. Charlemagne doesn't really have any direct connection to Rome. He's not a Roman. He's a German. He was born in what we would today call Germany, in Aachen. But what it does is it makes Europe look like the seat of political power. Before, Rome was kind of in the central location for both North Africa and for Syria, as well as places like Spain and a little bit of Germany. But now Charlemagne is saying, okay, but what if the most powerful thing was in Germany, in my town of Aachen? What if Germany was the most powerful empire? So that is going to sort of change the way people think about things. And I think this is another moment where things shift, where people stop seeing the Roman Empire is this sort of circle around the pond, and start thinking about Europe. Europe's where it's at. I mean, it's such a default pattern for us to think of today that it's hard to even recognize sometimes. But we could be thinking of, that whole sort of Mediterranean coast as one political unit. But instead, we think of Europe as a political unit. And this is almost, in a way, a time when the idea of Europe is being invented, because Charlemagne is saying that's what matters. And over time, that's going to drift further and further north until suddenly Britain is saying Britain is the center of the universe, and that's what matters. So yeah, it's a change that sort of leads us towards the world that we have today. And Charlemagne's endorsing Leo as well, I should say, because I'm going to talk about this more next time, but there's some tension between the different bishops. There's the Bishop of Rome, and then there's also bishops in Constantinople. They call themselves the Patriarchs, and Syria and various other parts of the Byzantine Empire. But then we've got this one bishop in the West who's in charge of Rome. Well, eventually, the Roman Catholic Church is going to say that one bishop has the authority over the whole church. And so Charlemagne is maybe one of the first to make this happen in a big way, because he's saying that Leo is the one who should be the leader of the church. And meanwhile, the Pope is saying Charlemagne's the one who should be the leader of the world on a political level. So this alliance elevates them both and is a landmark for both of their sort of ideas and cultures. And this, the idea of the Holy Roman Empire is going to be so compelling that people are going to keep coming back to it over and over again. In the 1100s, which we're not really going to talk about, but in the 1100s, there's going to be this guy named Frederick Barbarossa who says, yeah, we're doing the Holy Roman Empire. Germany is basically the Holy Roman Empire, and it's a big deal, and, it should rule as much territory as possible. And then another guy much later on is going to come along who says that about Germany, and his name is Hitler. And that's Hitler's Third Reich. It means the third rule, so the third version of the Holy Roman Empire. Not something people talk a whole lot about, but yeah, this was the original, and none of them are the actual Roman Empire. The Byzantines are more the Roman Empire than these guys are the Roman Empire. As you can imagine, the Byzantines were not super stoked about Leo and Charlemagne doing this, because it basically said, oh, you don't count. Your church doesn't count, and your empire doesn't count. So there was going to be tension surrounding that. And we can look at the map again, and here's the Byzantines, and here's that Frankish Holy Roman Empire. So yeah, I guess we are going to get into this now then. Okay, so basically, like I said, it used to be all one church. What we today think of as the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church were originally one and the same. But over time, especially as the sort of lines of communication between those two parts of the world, between Rome and the Byzantines, as those lines of communication disintegrated, the churches started to drift apart. Today, the Eastern Orthodox Church is the Church of Greece and Russia and a little bit the Middle East, where there are Christians in the Middle East. But today, the Roman Catholic Church is more well known because it was the church throughout Europe and the church for Latin America. And basically where these two really differ is on this idea of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Should the Bishop of Rome be the sort of one leader of the church? Because Jesus does say St. Peter is going to be the leader of his church. And then St. Peter founds the Church of Rome. That would be an argument that people could use for that. There were also other arguments. One document claimed that Constantine had appointed Rome as the head of the church. Unfortunately, we now think that document was a forgery. And because these churches were separate by political structures and it was getting harder and harder for them to communicate with each other, they evolved some other differences as well. For instance, the Roman Church naturally speaks Latin, and the Greek Church, or the Eastern Church, I should say, speaks Greek. And that led to a lot of problems where they had to translate theological ideas back and forth between different documents. And they also had a debate over the nature of the Holy Spirit. The Roman Catholic Church argues that the Holy Spirit is sort of created by both the Son and the Father in the Trinity. And the Eastern Church says that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father only, and that's a point of contention. May not matter to you necessarily if theology is not what you care about, but it led to different people seeking political power and arguing with each other over it. Also, a difference between the Roman Catholics use unleavened bread. No yeast doesn't rise for Eucharist bread. When you eat of Jesus's body and do that in remembrance of him, whereas the Orthodox Church uses leavened bread, so it's more like a biscuit than a cracker. So all these things were just sort of causing these churches to drift apart. And especially the Eastern patriarchs, who had like these 7 different elders who were leading the church, did not want to be told what to do by this outsider, the Bishop of Rome. And eventually, in the Middle Ages, it leads to a schism, as they call it, which is when churches have a fight, when churches split. That's what happened. Things got sort of more and more drift apart, and then by 1054 they were yelling at each other, and so they mutually excommunicated each other, which both of them said, you're kicked out of the religion. And so now effectively you had 2 religions. And you can see the line goes right down through here. Really very heavily based on the Byzantine Empire having its own views, and the Holy Roman Empire being much more Latin-based. Although this is not the same Holy Roman Empire as Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, but, the area of Europe as we think of it. And there were some other debates going on as well. For instance, I said that both Judaism and Islam had, at various points and to varying degrees depending on where you go and who you ask, a debate over whether people should make images, particularly in a religious context. And Christianity had less of a problem with this, but there does emerge a debate over the icon. So to some extent in the Roman Church, but even more in the Eastern Church, there are icons, which are images of the saints, usually painted with this gold background, and you can ask the saints for help. You can call on them. You can venerate them. You can call on Mother Mary. You can call on famous leaders. You could even call on Constantine, because he's a saint, and ask them to help you in various ways. And you would keep these little images of your home, and you would look at them during prayer. And in a sense, almost pray to them, although that's not strictly said. It's more said, venerate them. You pray to God, but you respect the saints. But in the same way that you can pray to God, you can call on the saints. So there is a similarity there. So you can see there is a tension here. Are people just calling on the saints, or are they doing something that goes against God? So they also called these icons, which just means image in Greek. And in certain periods of Byzantine history, there started to be iconoclasm, which means image breaking, which basically means a movement that is very passionately against these images. That happened to the church a couple of different times, where patriarchs of Constantinople, and also emperors, because really, let's be honest, the patriarchs were answering to the emperors a lot of the time. So if a certain emperor decided these images were unholy, if they were sort of depriving God of worship and getting in the way for people, people would be told to go and destroy all their images, and they would be confiscated. That's the fear, is that people aren't really worshiping God, and that it's also going against the tradition, which is not to make an image of God. But then another patriarch and emperor would come in and say, oh, no, actually, the right thing to do is to have the images. And if you were destroying them, then you were the heretics, actually. And so it goes back and forth until finally it settles on saying images are okay. But probably some of this had to do with interacting with these Islamic cultures and feeling like, they're very anti-image. Maybe we should be anti-image too. Maybe a sense of competition, like if they've got this idea, why can't we get the right idea? But ultimately, I think the icons stayed around, and they're pretty popular today. Okay, next we'll talk about Empress Irene. So we'll talk about Byzantium, and we'll talk about the Islamic world.